Thank you, thank you. Is there anybody here who's not interested in blockchain? The talk is mostly about identity and how it relates to things like blockchain and especially Chamas, which is kind of different for you guys because basically we are here, a couple of white guys. Eva's from Germany, I'm from Australia originally, and we're going to tell you what Chamas are, except we don't know anything and you know everything, so it's going to be a kind of an odd talk, but it comes out of the fact that we have been trying to educate the rest of the world on what Chamas are because we're using these concepts quite seriously in our business. So I want to pose some initial questions for you to try and just set the scene for where we're going. Basically, what is it that makes the money move around the world? Is it investments? Is it security? Is it trading, privacy, etc., etc.? There's all sorts of questions we can look at this, and many people have different opinions. Right, and secondly, what makes a good community? Communities can be many things. They can be resilient, they can be strong, they can be powerful, they can also be spread out and small and so forth. So how do we build these things? And finally, what is identity and why do we need it? Especially, I'd like to pose this question, do we need it, in fact, to be able to do what we want to do? And if we do need it, where are we going to find it? And this is our identity. For what it's worth, I would wonder why people want to know this, but they do want to know this. We've got a bunch of people here. Michael is heading up our Kenya side. We're basically based out of Bermuda because we're our chairman and our legal counsel work there and have been working very hard to finance this operation. They have connections all the way across the Caribbean, so that's it's very useful for us, and it's also very interesting to see the similarities and differences between, say, the African market and the Caribbean market. And big, powerful team there. So why is identity important? We want to trade. We all want to do business. We all want to get out there and make a profit so that we can pay for a good lifestyle. And to do that, we need to meet a lot of people, and we need to trade with a lot of people. So it turns out that trade is kind of difficult if you don't trust anybody, if you can't trust people. So we need that identity notion. It is believed that identity will solve the trust problem. Is that the case? Well, maybe. We'll see. Why now why is this coming to the forefront now? I've been doing this since 1995. We built the first digital asset trading system. We got it up and going in 95, went through various instances of this. The 2000s was fairly quiet, but we did some good stuff there. In Kenya, we were here 2012 to 2014, working this basic, this plan. But what's changed is blockchain, which is why you're all interested in it, and there's nobody who's uninterested in it. Blockchain has created a wave of opportunity. So consequently, that gives us a really, if you like, a good push in the right direction. But there's one thing about blockchain which is very unusual, and that is this notion that it's trustless. It allows people to come together and do trades when they might otherwise be adversarial. They might fight with each other, or they might take the money off the table if they get the chance. Whereas blockchain seems to solve that in some magical fashion. So it's raising the question, maybe we don't need trust after all. But actually, funnily enough, blockchain may be trustless, but it's not particularly trustworthy. The history of losses and frauds and thievery and DDoS attacks and failures of the chain is quite long and horrible. The amount of money that's lost is estimated about 10% of the value that's there. So it's not as if it's the answer to everything. It's less reliable or less trustworthy than, say, banking. You lose less money in the banks than you do if you held it in Bitcoin. The issue then is this notion of trust is actually, it's a little bit slippery. We're on both sides of the equation here. And it's somewhat the case that if you take the average Bitcoin community or the Ethereum community or any of those other communities, I'm related to the EOS community, they are full of individuals. Individuals who are coming in because it's exciting, looking to do something, and hoping that it's all going to work. What is not happening is business. Big business is keeping away. They're not putting a lot of money in. There's a lot of talk, but there's not a lot of action. If you look at, for example, Ethereum has been working for the last, must be getting close to 4 years now. And what businesses are running on Ethereum at this stage? Not an awful lot. We've got ICOs, which is raising money to finish off the chain. We've got CryptoKitties is about the only business running on Ethereum that seems to be working. So it is a hypothesis, if you like, that what's missing for business is trust. And specifically, they probably think of identity as being important to gain that trust. So we are at a position where, if you like, there are multiple, we've got different theories about what's going on, but what's very clear is business is not bailing in, is not buying into blockchain as yet, regardless of the talk. So, what is identity? I hand over to Eva. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. Yes, we are coming from the West, so we have first to look at the Western world, what we do there or what is done there. The first notion. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry. The first notion of identity that you also have, that everybody has, is state-oriented. So that it's coming from the state, that you have your passport, your identity card, stuff like that. Or you get a tax number or a social security number or whatever number they give you. And actually, it's the state giving us our identity, which somehow doesn't really feel right, because we are here regardless of the state, and we are not just numbers. We are much more than numbers, I believe. So this is only partly working. And if we consider what is done with this, it's actually mostly about control, understanding who is a citizen or who is a resident or living there or moving in or out, and also access to a lot of things, be it banking, be it whatever is controlled by identity cards or passports. So, yeah, that's probably not what we need for our trade, because not everybody can get it. The next version is corporations. We have a lot of corporations, and every corporation on the internet, for example, needs you to set up an account. There's nearly no corporation that goes without an account. And there's banks, there's social media like Facebook, like Google, like Twitter, whatever you do, and online shops and what all. So what are they asking for? They're asking that we add voluntarily our data, but the data that they need for what they want to do. So it's not what we need, but they need something for their regulations, the banks, for example, know your customer, or they need something, the social media wants to collect data to better place advertisements so that they earn more money from their customers, their real customers, because we are not the customers of the social media, we are just the users. And the customers are the big companies who are buying advertisement space. Or online shops, they want to reduce risks, but they are not really interested in us. They just want to know where to send something, but also want to be able to say, well, here is the person, I want to jail the person or something like that. So it's about what they want, not what we need. And their interest, not ours. So the next thing, if you go to the Western world, what people would tell you is, well, I am me because I believe I am who I am, and inside me I have a picture of myself, and I grew up from a small child, and now I'm a person, whatever, and I have an internal picture, which is possibly important because a lot of elements about myself are created there. It's important for us as person, but you will not be able to know what I believe I am. So you cannot rely on this information, and I have no idea what you are thinking about yourself, and it doesn't help me to trust you what you think about yourself. If you think you are a thief, or if you think you're a good person, or if you think whatever, I cannot see it. Yeah. So that's not helping others. So we have to get somewhere else. We have to get where we are. So we are people among people. And actually people know about people. So everybody here introduced himself or herself, and we know your name, you know my name, and we have some idea. You also said something about your interests. Okay, everybody is interested in blockchain, but you added something more. And everybody here knows somebody of somebody else. And we could describe, well, there was this person who was sitting next to me and had interest, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, this is what people do. This is what you would tell other people. And this is where we learn who we can trust, because we ask other people. This is our identity that we share among each other. So, but this is just between people. How can we use it on the internet, on the blockchain, somewhere in the software? That's so far not really done. We call this identity within, and it's really the identity among our community, among our peers, among our family, among our business or whatever we do. So it's among our group. And we get there by participating. So I am talking to you, and you are listening to me, and by this we have some interaction. And afterwards we are chatting with each other, or you are chatting among each other, and you're getting some feeling. That's interaction between yourself, or you maybe do a small trade, or somebody may even hire somebody else, or whatever's happening. So that's interactions between people, and these interactions are those that are building the trust among us people. Yeah, so how we do this? We meet each other. So everybody meets people every day, the ones we know, but also others that we don't know. And we introduce each other, and afterwards we can say, well, I can say I met Ian, or something like that, or I met you. And you can say, well, I met Eva, for example. And yeah, that's what we can do. And we could capture this statement, and if everybody does this, we get the so-called web of trust. This is a known thing on the internet. The first that I know about is PGP, but others have tried it as well. So everybody says, well, I met this person is the person, you can trust the person because I tell you you can trust the person because I met the person. Something like that. Yeah. So what we do is we take the statements and afterwards say, this was the person I met. Alice is the usual example, so we say, this was Alice, or this is Alex. And then we say, I'm Bob, or I'm Eva, and I say, this is Alice. We can do this again. So Bob can say, Alice is Alice, then Carol can say, Alice is Alice, then Dave can say, Alice is Alice, then Eve can say, Alice was Alice, and if we do it again and again and again, we get more confident in the statement. And at some point, we can just say, well, Alice actually is Alice, because 100 people have said, yes, Alice is Alice. It's not just one person. It's a repeated statement that we note down in our software that Alice is Alice. And then others can rely on this, because we have collected all this data from others. So actually your name, this name Alice, is the sum of all those beliefs, of all those people you met, of all those people who have spoken to, that your name actually is Alice. But where's your name coming from? It's coming from your parents. Your parents gave you this original name that you had. It's not coming from yourself, it's coming from others. Then maybe you have a nickname because your name is too complicated. My last name, for example, would not work anywhere outside of Germany because it's too complicated. So people will call you with different names, with nicknames, but it's not who decide how they call me. It's the others who decide how to call me, because it's their nickname for me. The others decide what my name is, so it's actually a name is a community thing. It's not a personal thing, even if you believe it to be. It's you who give me my name. Yeah. But is a name enough for our identity? I don't think that a name is all we are about, and actually a name is not really clear because it's Alice, or Alice in Wonderland, or Alice single, Alice married, Alice from Egypt, Alice from whatever, or from the company Y, or whatever. So Alice, a name, is hard to describe because everybody would call her differently, slightly differently, and we want to capture this. So we have to define what exactly we want to know. We have to do a protocol if we want to put it in this software. It's a process that we have to define how to get there. And we did this some years ago, 15 years ago or something. We tried it out with CSCert, which is a certification agency. It doesn't really matter what it is, but what we actually did, we built up a web of trust, meeting people, making statements about each other, and noting this down in a software. And if we were certain enough that this is okay, we were giving out certificates about the name, so that others could rely on the fact that their name is actually the name that they had. This created some kind of meaning and responsibility, and it actually worked. It scaled. We had 100,000 accounts, 20,000 active persons, 6,000 persons who were actually doing this you thing, this assurance, how we called it, and well, we had some more data. But it actually was a big thing. Yes, so what did we do? We did a protocol, a policy about this. So we said, assure, that is me, says assuree, that would be, for example, Ian, is somebody according to our policy, because we had some procedures that we did. And by this, we defined how to figure out the name of a person. But I don't think names are enough. We are not numbers, we are not just names, we are persons. So we have a name, we have a date of birth, we have a photo, we have relatives, we have contacts, we have documents, we have experience, we have skills, we have whatever. We can cook, we can drive, we are coders, we are whatever we are photographs, whatever we are. So we have a life, we have history, we have wisdom. This is our identity. This is what we are. This is what you are interested in. You're not interested in my name. You would forget my name directly. You're not interested in any numbers about me. You're interested in my experience because I'm sharing it with you. Yes, and I'm interested in your experience. So we are more than names. So we want to figure all this and put it into a policy and say that someone says something else about another person according to our standard that we define, so that we can pick all of these different attributes, how we call them, and put it into a policy so that others could then rely on this, that others could capture this identity. Yes, so we have multiple things. I more or less described this already. So somebody is just saying, it's my friend, that's Alice. Somebody else would say, well, I've spoken a lot with her. We have so many history shared. We have stories shared. Somebody else provides a picture. Somebody else provides whatever, the next name, whatever it is. So everybody is providing some part of it. And those are attributes. And we combine them. So when we combine them, we collect them, we actually get to the combined identity of the person. It's not the single statements, it's the statements of different attributes provided by different people according to the standard that we provide. So it's everybody adds a tiny bit of the identity and we collect it, and then we can, at some point it grows, we have her identity, we know who Alice actually is, and it's more than a name, it's how she looks, how she what she talks and stuff like that. And that's her identity in this group, the ones that she interacts with. But, well, why can we say that somebody would actually do this? Why would somebody care to do it? And why would they care to do it correctly? So we need more than just a policy about statements. people only tell the truth about very specific things if you tell them that if they don't tell the truth, they get some negative feedback, and if they tell the truth, they get some positive feedback. So we have to reward them positively or negatively. So far we have seen that we need some assets in there, because else if we don't have an asset, we cannot award something or punish somebody. And we have to be liable based on these assets for our errors. So the assets have to count in the context of our errors. If we do an error, then our asset is damaged. Well, how do we get there? We get there by defining policies and procedures so that we actually agree that we do this. Everybody joins into this agreement that this is what we want to do, and this is how we want to do it, and everybody is equal. I'm not better than you, and everybody has to do the same, and everybody has the same rights and the same obligations, and will be liable in the same manner. And this liability we capture by doing dispute resolution, which I describe on the next slide, which is, we call it arbitration. A lot of people are not so, have some bad feelings about arbitration, but actually it's a good thing. It's, you have a dispute, you're not sure if you're doing the correct thing, or the other did the correct thing, so you file a dispute into the system. Then the system adds an arbitrator who is some of us, somebody else of us who is not involved in this thing. So it's a peer, but somebody who is neutral to this situation. They're independent, and then they provide an independent human decision after hearing both parties. And there's a ruling, there's a decision, and then we know, was there an error, or was the other just suspecting an error? And then we can say, well, if there was an error, the person has to be punished. If they told the truth, we can actually rely on the statement much more than if there wouldn't have been this process. So this is how we make people responsible for their actions. And if they don't do what they should do, what they agreed to do, it's not because somebody told them, because they agreed to it, then we can punish them, and then we should punish them, and that's the skin in the game that everybody has. This is what we did in CS3rd. So we had a community, we built up a community, we had these processes, and beside of these processes, they led to liabilities, and we could correct via arbitration. And actually in CS3rd this worked for 15 years. But there was something else that wasn't really working, because we could only do names and maybe birth dates, but that's not much, because this community was so big that we couldn't agree on something else that is relevant, or had the time to tell something about everybody else. So it was too big a community. So this is where we failed. And this is where Ian comes back.
Okay, back to Kenya. We came here 2012 thinking, yeah, M-Pesa, great thing, miracle, this is going to be the future of financial cryptography. And when we got here, well, yeah, it was good, but it wasn't the future we were looking for. But one thing which really became apparent was that when we started talking to people, there was this really big disconnect between the white NGO community and the you people, the locals. And unfortunately, you've got this great name for it, the Wazungu. We're the Wazungu. We don't know anything, we don't see anything, and we change nothing, so we should just leave. But unfortunately, or fortunately, we discovered chamas. And it was just luck that we asked the right questions. They told us about chamas, and so we pursued this and discovered basically what chamas were. You know, and you all know what chamas are because you live them. How many people here are a member of a chama? Oh, about a third. How many people know what a chama is? Does anybody not know what a chama is? Okay, great. So I don't need to say anything about that, but what I will say is it's our hypothesis that the reason chamas exist, because the reason they do what they do is because of corruption. which is to say, if you didn't do it that way, somebody would take the money. So you're forced to do it that way, which is important, if you like, to recognise from a Western rich country perspective, because we look at it from the outside and we say, why are you doing this? It's crazy. You should just go to the bank and put the money in the bank, or you should just keep the money safe at home. That doesn't work, and you know that doesn't work. So Chamas, from our perspective, what we're looking at is, gosh, in a Chama, unlike other institutions, everybody trusts each other. And that turns out to be really key. You come together in a Chama to save money, so you have to trust each other. But you also come together because you can't trust yourself to save money. So together as a group, you save money much better. And it also gives you this sense of, oh gosh, there's money on the table, this money is mine, the group is responsible for protecting it. We've all got skin in the game. We've all got this sense of responsibility, because if I muck up, I might lose my money. If you all muck up, I still might lose my money. We're all in this together. So it turns out that Chamas are really quite strong against outside theft. Chamas don't really often get robbed from outsiders. I mean, you might say something different and surprise us, but I think that's how it is. Chamas are also quite strong, not as strong, but strong against insider theft as well, because you've developed your processes and your theories and your ways of doing things over, 50 years since they first started. And then there's this notion that you import trust into the Chama and you grow it. And we were talking today to a woman in a Chama, and she was saying her life has just changed dramatically because she started in the last 3 years working with a Chama. So now she feels so much better and alive and well because of that experience. So coming back to identity, we wanted to start about this whole identity thing. It turns out the Chama is the ideal place for an identity, if you go back to that original discussion about what an identity is. And so what we're really coming along and saying is that certainly in Kenya and countries like that, these small groups of trusted people, they are the beating heart of the economy. They're what makes the transport move. The matatus are all owned by Chamas or SACCOs. They are what finances the businesses. Something like 42% of the economy is financed in this mechanism. But Chamas have problems. Like any group, especially a group of people who are trying to get ahead, they're hotbeds of intrigue, there are problems, there's work to be done, somebody doesn't turn up, somebody's short of money. The accounting is a real problem. They work with paper. You've got to hold these little books, you've got to store the little books, you can lose the book, you can make mistakes with accounting, you can make mistakes with numbers. It takes a long time to write it all out. And you end up with a very ad hoc sense of what it is that you own, a very casual sense, which it's hard to get to grips with. If somebody makes a big mistake, everything can go wrong. The experience we've heard, you ask somebody what went wrong with their Chama and they say, the treasurer mucked it all up because of the accounting. It's not their fault, it's the accounting. And also, one of the things that occurs, and this is kind of a bit weird, the Chamas themselves can do quite well and save quite a bit of money, but when they go to invest the money, it's really a bit tough to find a good investment. It's hard to buy land. It's dangerous to buy a matatu and run it up and down the streets and get it back at the end of the day because of all these risks. And of course, there's the ever-present problem of corruption. So it's our theory that we want to automate what the Chamas are doing. We don't want to change what the Chamas are doing because they already know what they're doing. What we want to do is just get rid of that accounting nightmare and improve it by putting it into a form of digital cash. And once you do that, if you turn it into a form of digital cash, think about Bitcoin or Ethereum or something like that, you have this sense that you've now got a solid digital asset which is much more tangible than the paper books and so forth and so on. So that brings us to the notion of what we're trying to do. The big idea is we basically take Kenya's Chamas and we add in the governed approach to community into the Chama, which was described in the earlier section. We add a fair bit of blockchain in there to help us with the accounting and with the process and the security and privacy, and we make an app out of it onto the Android phone. So if we take the notion of the community, the Chama is a very small community, say from 5 to 30 people or so when they start up. We add in the constitutional relationship, which they actually have. All Chamas have a constitution, but we tweak that a little bit to add arbitration as a repair kit. And this is something we've experienced in the Chama that we ran and the Chamas we've talked to. It's actually relatively easy to understand because most of the people, especially the people from the countryside and so forth, not so much core Nairobi, they have the knowledge of elders being the dispute resolvers. So we're basically saying let's put a more formal flavour, a paint job on the notion of elders as dispute resolvers. And we then use the digital capabilities with the identity notion, the statements that we were talking about before, the attributes. We record them as relationships. And then we take those relationships, those attributes, sum them all together, and that creates a sense of identity. And from that identity, we can then create statements from Chama to Chama and try and bring those Chamas together. That's further into the future, but that's where we're heading. Okay. The investment it's very interesting because the Chamas already have their goal. We've been searching around for a way to make this happen in the West, and it just isn't quite as precise as we'd like it. So here we are back in Kenya because Kenya's got it in the Chamas. They've got the purpose, they've got the skin in the game, they know what they want to do, they all want to save money and get ahead. And they also have this ability to back every member. They've imported the trust into the Chama, they know every member of the Chama, so they're therefore prepared to stand up and say, this member is good, which is a statement you can take to another Chama. There are about 1 million Chamas in Kenya, so that means you can take it a long way across the country. And if all the Chamas are working together digitally, then you can make statements that allow trust to flow across the entire country. And the software provides the accounting. I mean, this is basically your blockchain, blah, blah, blah. And it really does something extra, which is splits the responsibility between the Chama for the accounting. They enter the values and so forth, but it also places the strong transactional logic into the blockchain or software such that now you've got a situation where the Chama can't accidentally move the money or on purpose steal the money because the money is now shared across the blockchain. You've now got that immutable strength which the blockchain is somewhat famous for. And here I mentioned the identity. So what does the blockchain do for us? The first thing is that the cash, the Kenya shilling, is a unit of currency that we want to be the, if you like, the front office for the Chama in the sense that somebody comes into the Chama with Kenya shillings. We want to convert that into a digital Kenya shillings unit. And it stands to reason, it's obvious that what we want is a digital Kenya shilling that goes across all of the Chamas. They all use the same digital shilling. And for that, we probably want to put that on a blockchain for the security. We can run it independently, we can run it as an organization, we can run it just like Safaricom's running it. But if it's on the blockchain, it's somewhat more secure. We can also do the same thing for instruments. The notion of each Chama, certainly the ones that go into long-term savings and investment, is that they create another unit, which is their shares in the assets of the Chama, from which you get dividends every year. That's an instrument. That's a digital instrument which can be turned into a cryptocurrency style of unit and managed in a blockchain context. And it turns the actual asset of their holdings, their holdings inside the Chama, into a digital asset, which means it can be traded back and forth, moved back and forth, which is inefficient and impractical to do when you're working with paper. So you're moving one step closer to creating a financial system. We want to use blockchains for privacy, but actually blockchains are really terrible for privacy because you can see all the transactions in the blockchain. So let's flip this problem upside down and say, okay, we will give each Chama a single blockchain. Each Chama will have its own blockchain, which will live on its own phones in a form which is complicated and technical and so forth. But we can do that. So instead of saying we will have one blockchain for all of Kenya's Chamas, no, we'll have all of Kenya's Chamas with their own blockchain, and then we'll integrate them together. And that notion of immutable records gives that safety. So that's Chamapesa. It's an app to basically do cryptocurrencies for Chamas. It's designed based on software which we've had running for a long time. It basically works. We discovered the Chamas in Kenya, of course, but the actual idea can be exported to the world, and that's what we're intending to do once we get it up and going. Okay, so talking about those original questions, communities. So communities turn out to be of different sizes, and this becomes really key. Small communities are hard to administer. They're quite expensive, and so we can speed that up with applications, apps on phones. But they're also very hard to manage when they get larger as well. And it turns out that there are reasons for this. There's a medium number, somewhere in the middle, which is quite sensible. And this relates to anthropology and a thing called the Dunbar number, which is based on the size of the brain. And your brain, and our brain, and my brains, we're all optimized for a certain number of relationships. The number is about 150, but what that means is somewhere around about 150, maybe it's 80, maybe it's 250, it's a very vague number, but somewhere around there are the number of people I can know well, the number of people you can know well. So if you consider your family, they're in there, and you consider all your school friends, they're in there, and your workmates, they're in there. When it comes to the Chama, you're starting to run out of capacity. So groups that are small are actually natural to humans. Groups that are large are not natural to humans. And it turns out this actually relates to trust. Groups that get too large become untrustworthy. So small groups turn out to be best. And also the notion of Chamas bringing in the skin of the game. Yeah, click on. So what we're basically saying is we've got it wrong. We don't want a huge community. What we want is many, many small communities, which we link together, because those small communities can create the savings to take on the responsibility and look after each other, and they can, by that mechanism, import their trust and use that to grow as individuals inside the group. And then when we've got that running, which you've got in the Chamas, we can export that. We can capture it digitally and make statements about each person, which they can then take across to any other scenario. Which is to say, with the new technology that has come out of blockchain and identity and so forth, we can solve the identity problem on the internet. It turns out it does actually drop out for free. So what did what made money go round? We would say that what makes money go round is relationships and trust. You don't do deals with people you don't trust. Complicated business is done with people you know. And what makes good communities? Well, actually, perversely, it turns out that small groups are what makes good communities. And also, the lesson from Kenya, if you like, the corruption lesson is actually a bit of adversity makes a good community. Rough life outside the community makes the community inside stronger. And where do we find this? We actually find this on the internet. If you look at blockchain, you'll find it's a very aggressive community of people. They're always fighting over something. So part of the problem is they're too big. We should bring them down to being small communities. And then finally, what is identity? Well, it's what we find in those small communities. Our personas are best seen as the way our community sees us. And that community should be a small and good community. And that's the end. Now we have a microphone for questions.
Hello.
Does anybody have a question?
That was a great presentation, guys. So, I don't think they introduced themselves, so before you go to questions, I'd just like them to introduce themselves.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, my identity, how important is that?
Yeah, just tell us a bit about yourself.
So I got started in this space, financial cryptography, back in 1995 when we discovered digital cash. At the time in Amsterdam, that was the center of the world. A person called David Chaum had invented the magic blinding formula, which allowed people to move numbers across the internet transparently but privately, so the numbers couldn't be traced. And if these numbers meant money, then you could now move money privately across the internet, just like you could do with a hand-to-hand cash transaction. This was really exciting. It bootstrapped the whole field known as cypherpunks. I got into Amsterdam and started building not digital cash systems, but digital everything else systems, digital asset systems. So we were building bonds and shares and derivatives and so forth. All of these things traded back and forth, so that was great. I did that for a fair amount of time, but you know, the 1990s really had a lot of trouble coping with this. They say it's too early. I don't know, maybe. 2000s, not very much happened, but I slipped into identity and I worked with CA Cert, which is where Eva and I got together. And there what we were doing was literally identity and certificates for a certification authority, which involved, for my part, auditing and also building up this notion of how do we know that the person we're dealing with is in fact that person, and more importantly, what reliability can we place on this person? And you know, I'm comfortable in saying that we built the only certificate authority that is reliable and trustworthy. And then got to Kenya in 2012 and we built this thing, and sadly we couldn't convince any of the NGOs to provide us the capital, so we had to shut down. But now we've moved forward to the ICO age and so forth and so on. There is money available for these projects, and we are going direct to market to sell a token to make this happen. That's my story.
Yes, mine is just much shorter. I started some law studies at university, then I switched over to computer science, so I'm a coder, I'm a software developer by job. And beside of that, I did a lot of communities. I were interested in a lot of hobbies and a lot of other things, and I always ended to be one of them who created the constitution, the structure, whatever. So I'm doing communities more or less. And at some point I came to CA Cert, and there I became an arbitrator. So I did the governance there. I did the rulings, the dispute stuff, which is a very specific perspective on communities. Yes, and then I don't know much about blockchains actually, but Ian told me this is where I should to go, which is very interesting and fascinating, and actually is quite a lot of what I have done before, beside of the blockchain, which I have to learn.
Okay, I think Ian left out one thing. He failed to mention that the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, they used some invention which he created. It's called the triple ledger accounting. So this is the closest to Satoshi Nakamoto that you'll ever get. So let's get into questions. If anyone has a question, we just take rounds of 3. So 3 questions, then you have them answered, then next 3 questions. So who go first? 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Hi guys, thanks so much for doing this, and appreciate it. Just a quick question. Maybe you could go a bit more. I think most people here will be double ledger accounting. Maybe you could go a bit more into sort of like the architecture behind triple ledger. And then secondly is how do you perhaps see the future of, say for example, marrying microservices architecture with blockchain technology?
Should I answer that? Because
Sure, because my question is also your first question. I just need to understand the technology behind the architecture. It's good pillars right away, and I like the fact that this is being contextualized to the channels. But it's interesting if we know the fundamentals, the real technology behind blockchain. Hopefully we can also apply it in other areas.
One last question then.
Remember the questions.
I love the presentation. So, what do you think of the design of protocols to transfer identity between these channel blockchains with power? Is there something that is part of the design, and is it something that has been challenging?
So I think where we start with the questions is a bit on triple entry. Okay, so triple entry is it a discovery or an invention? I'm not sure. It's what we did, and we figured out probably 8 years afterwards that it was in fact triple entry. Todd Boyle was the person who actually coined the term and came up with the theory and worked on it, but whereas I and my partner at the time, we were the ones who developed a working system. Triple entry accounting, or triple entry bookkeeping as it probably should be known as, is basically a notion where you take a transaction. If I'm doing a transaction with you, I create the data, and that data should be a transaction which is completely describable. It will go to you, and it will go to another third party, such as the person next to you. Then, with cryptography, we lock in the nature of the transaction. It's one record, which we're guaranteed to know everybody's got the same version of that record. So I know that what you see is what I see. That locks in the transaction. But there's one other problem, and that is, what happens if I lose my record? And you know I've lost my record. Then you quietly lose yours, and we're stuffed. Or I'm attacked. You've basically been able to bail out of a transaction or something like that. So what we need is a third party to hold a separate transaction and just to hold that as a backup copy, and also to do things like time ordering. So if you're doing, for example, lots of transactions, you want to get time ordering sorted out, which is where blockchain comes in. So triple entry just means that it's a cryptographically locked single record held by you and me and by a third party. Now, that's kind of what we built back in the 90s, but the third party was a server. Along comes Satoshi Nakamoto, reads the paper and says, yeah, that kind of works, but the server is a problem, because the server always gets attacked. And in fact, if you look into the late 90s, early 2000s, there's a big, long history of digital cash systems being attacked at the server. So we've got to replace the server. Hence the design of Bitcoin is to replace the server with a blockchain. But it's still triple entry, it's just that the blockchain is the third entry, and it happens to be duplicated across 1,000 mining nodes. So if you like, it's taking one notion which was very interesting, challenging, tantalizing to the accountants, and then putting it into a different context which replaced that one flaw. Now how we do that, how we create those records is very simple. I write a payment instruction, I sign it, and then I send it off. And as long as that payment instruction is accepted by the third party, it's a done deal. We actually do a bit more. We wrap some more stuff around it. So if you look at, for example, my work, it's based on the receipt notion. I create a payment, the third party creates a receipt around the payment and signs that, and that then becomes the record. So I don't get to see the record straight away, I've got to send it off. Then it comes back, you get the same copy, we've all got the same copy, I know that what you see is what I see. In the blockchain context, it's more complicated because they use this UTXO layout, which is just technical and so forth and so on. But in essence, it's the same problem in the sense that I create a payment and then it goes into the blockchain, and when it comes out, it's been accepted by the blockchain. So that final record that is sitting in the blockchain, the immutable stack of records, becomes the triple entry record of the history. That's triple entry. Your second question?
Actually the second question was sort of like thinking about the transition with IoT and a lot of sort of like stateless applications being built nowadays, and the emergence of Microsoft to marry that, for example, with a blockchain system.
Yeah. That's really hard because it's such a broad topic. Yeah. I mean, I'll ad lib a bit. So one of the things that's very interesting, and doesn't necessarily answer the question, but I hope you find it interesting. The way we have been doing software is to write out instructions, send them to databases, have the database do the work, commit itself, and then return a response back. And that's been the way that software's worked for the last 30, 40 years. And you can build up stacks of this stuff and so forth. There is an alternate method which we started using in the mid-90s, and it's got a name. It's called event sourcing. And the alternate method works this way. We create a message, we send the message in, the thing that's going to do the processing does the processing. If it accepts the message, it puts the message into a log and then carries on. Seems like the same thing, but the difference is what it's put into the log is the message. It's committing to the message, and the work is not committed to. So the work is sitting in the computer's memory. If the computer crashes, it has to redo all the work again. Whereas with your normal database, what happens is it does the work and writes the work to the disk. If the computer crashes, it just reads the work straight back again. It doesn't redo it. And this is called event sourcing. It's a message-based paradigm. And this is what we're using in EOS, which is a new blockchain coming up. It's what I've used in all of my software. And it turns out to be really inconvenient if the server crashes, but really fast and really useful and accurate if things are going well. And I think what is going to happen is this is going to be more and more important in the future. And especially when you start thinking about microservices and so forth, more message-based stuff is going to happen than request-response work or request-work-response style of stuff is going to happen. I understand. That didn't really answer your question, but I thought it was interesting.
Okay. I have a question on porting identity. Yeah.
My question was about, say someone falls out with the Java that they're in. Say someone who has a falling out with the Java that they're in, and maybe needs to join another one.
Yeah.
Or they need to start a new one from, and they were a member of another one.
Yeah.
So, and they still need to transfer their identity in some way, in some reliable way across all of them. So,
How are they going to do that?
how do you do that? Is there like a protocol that you present for that? And what is considered a huge challenge to get solved?
Yeah.
Well, we don't have it figured out completely, but we have a lot of ideas going on there. We have this edge protocol that we described, so we collect the data already, and you can ask the charmer about the questions. So you can ask this charmer about the questions inside the charmer, but you have to follow the process. The data inside the charmer is only visible to the people in the charmer, to the phones of the charmer, but not to anybody else. So anybody else can come and say, well, I have a reason to ask this question. They ask the charmer, and the charmer will possibly only give you this detail that you need to know. And probably somebody has to sign it off, so the charmer has to sign it off, or the person has to sign it off. You can do this. Or you have a connection between the two charmers, so a person who is in two charmers. And then this charmer person, and this person in two charmers, can, again, with the authorization of the charmer, move the data from one charmer to the other charmer. Again, covering the privacy, but being the agent between the charmers, so that the other charmer can rely on the statement of this person who is their member, but also the member of the other charmer. But this has to follow process. Both has to follow process. The exact details are not completely finished now, but I think we are close. And the general idea is already there, but we are working on it.
Okay. Do you have any other questions? 3 more questions.
What was your question?
You answer.
Oh, okay.
Any other question? No one wants to know what the price of Bitcoin will be. Okay. Let's start down.
Yeah.
So he's asking how you could scale this to online communities or communities in another country.
Yes. I guess there are two ways that's going to happen. One is that, as you probably know, most people who are into the Chama scene are members of more than one Chama. And not only are they members of more than one Chama, they all know somebody who's an expatriate who's gone across to another country and is working. So one of Kenya's big exports is people. People go to London, to New York, to various business centres to do various business activities. All of those people retain their ties back to Kenya. They're still Kenyans. They're not leaving aside. They're not leaving their homeland. They're just working elsewhere for a time being. They can be members of Chamas too. And they can be members of Chamas both back in Kenya and in other countries. And so you can have the sense that a Chama doesn't have to be Kenyan, it can be worldwide. And you find, for example, especially in Indian communities and Chinese communities, they have very large extended families, and those extended families are all across the world. And they keep in contact with each other and they work with each other. That's a natural Chama-like institution, but it's cross-border. The second way in which this idea would export is to consider opportunities or businesses which would be more suitable out in the West. Especially in the Anglo world, we don't really see this as a particularly, shall we say, interesting process. And in part, it's because we don't face the same day-to-day corruption issue. But there are some areas where we do, and that is, quite oddly, the blockchain. There's a lot of people in the tech world who participate on blockchain, and they've done some small business, and they've done some holding, and they've done some value and so forth. But the problem they all face is that Bitcoin's really hard to secure. It's a lot of hassle. You've got to play with trezors and keys and passwords, and you get it wrong and you send your money off into the ether, or Ethereum. The same thing goes on with Ethereum, and you've got the DAO and all these sort of things. It's complicated and difficult. But what if you were to get together with a bunch of your mates and save together on the blockchain by holding various forms of crypto, which you would agree to hold on, but then you'd also divide up the tasks across the group. In each group of mates, there's always somebody who spends all his time watching the prices. And then there's somebody who knows about the latest Trezor patch or the latest wallet or the latest this or that. And then there are other people who know how to do accounting and manage numbers and so forth. If you carved up the responsibilities, then you would have a much better chance at successfully and safely holding crypto for the long run so you can build up your savings. And that's a notion that we want to explore once we get to that point. So that's the second part.
How do you keep the ledger lean, considering you designed it to mobile device?
Yeah. Yes. So the interesting thing is what we're doing is building the world's smallest, slowest, least scalable blockchain. If you consider how a Chama works, it comes together once a month, so the block length is 1 month, and it does what, 20 transactions, 30 transactions per month. So we're not exactly challenging Ethereum or EOS for scalability here. The actual transactions themselves are really quite small. We're talking about 100 a month or so. So putting that onto a mobile device isn't such a big deal. There's two things to consider. One is that our design at the moment actually facilitates through a server. So rather than being a completely distributed across the phone's blockchain, it bounces off a server. And there's a reason for that. You get much better connectivity that way, and you get much better reliability. Now, the transactions going to the server are encrypted, so the server can't do anything with those. So it's secure in that sense. You could run it directly on the phones. But once you do that, what you can do is start pruning the mobile phones. So that's one way. The other thing is that the infrastructure of identity is actually really important to the Chamas, of course. And that involves much more information. It's like 100 times messages, and then you get the photos, which are like 0.5 megabyte. because we're using photos as biometrics, so you can see who it is you're doing a transaction with. And that just dominates completely the financial transactions. So our problem isn't financial transactions on the blockchain or on the mobile. Our problem is reducing the number of messages that people send to each other and, you know, keeping the social experience alive with the limited capacity of a mobile phone. That's just exactly the same problem that every social app has had on the mobile phone. So we're in good company, I guess.
I think you kind of touched on what I'm going to ask now, but earlier you alluded to small blockchains creating a bigger network of blockchains, and also that there would be some kind of service that identity that's been created could be used for. And I'm wondering how much information can these other service providers really gain from understanding that, you know, these shamas have been successfully managed and that these people are trusted at that level, and what kind of services do you see that?
So sort of like credit reporting and so forth and so on. That's the obvious one. The interesting thing about this is that a really well-formed Chama network doesn't need credit reporting because it creates its own finance. The banks, for example, only cherry-pick the nicest possible deals, but meanwhile the people have to borrow money and they have to save money, and they do all this without the banks. And if they can do it more efficiently, they don't need the banks at all. So credit reporting is not such an issue. But you could see things like banks looking at chamas for the purposes of bank accounts, or corporations looking at chamas for the purposes of identity, or the state, or et cetera, et cetera. Now, the way we are thinking about this, and it's far in the future, is that the actual information belongs to the chama, to the individuals, and it doesn't leave the chama. However, the chama itself could make a summary statement on the behalf of the individual who needs that statement. So if you're going to get a job at some corporation and they want to know, you know, letters of good reference from 2 or 3 chamas, you could get that from your chamas at the next meeting. And they could prepare them, letterhead them, you know, digitally, and send them to the appropriate place, and then they would exist for the period of time and then be expected to be deleted once they're read. So it would be a case of, if you like, the chamas are in control of the information. You can't have the information going out in raw form, because then corporations will start collecting it and tracking it, and they're not anybody's friend. So it has to be filtered through this summary process. That's our thinking at the moment, but we're a long way from actually deploying anything like that.
And then and the transactions between all those Shama blockchains, what would they be? Are they more business dealings, more?
Well, so the far distant future here is that once we've got each chama happily working with its savings in its organization under its constitution, which is compatible with other chamas, and with arbitration, which is compatible with other chamas, we can link them together such that one chama could, given permission, hold the assets of another chama, which means that a chama would need to be a member of another chama. Now, it turns out that this is a natural structure. There are chamas of chamas. There are umbrella groups which look after a bunch of chamas. Today we were talking to one small chama of 14 women in a local town, and the credit reporting officer? Asili, yeah. And 2 people were there to help that particular chama do their records. That particular organisation would be a natural way to pass through transactions, and they would run, if you like, some issuances from their particular chama that all the other chamas could share with. That's one way. The other way is you have horizontal linkages such that one chama joins as an associate membership. It's possible through blockchain to have them completely open and unconstrained. So there's, if you like, different options.
Okay.
How are we going?
Any more questions? I'll take the last questions. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
My question is around security. So with the blockchain, the notion is that because it's decentralized, then it's really hard to compromise the entire blockchain. So in this particular case, a single entity is running the infrastructure with this small blockchains. So that means if somebody takes out this particular server that's managing these small blockchains, then you basically compromise the system. So how is that handled?
Yeah. So what you can do is put a stoppage or a blockage on the Chama's accounting. But firstly, with regard to this gentleman's question, the mobile phones do actually hold the transaction records. So what would happen is that they would go to the meeting, discover their server was down, and then simply buy another server and upload all their transactions to it. They have their transactions. In essence, what they can do is a live hard fork, because the server itself doesn't play a particularly important part in the transactions. It does two things. It holds them and it orders them, but it can't see them. They're encrypted, and the only people who hold the keys are the Chama itself. So if you compromise the server, it's like you've turned off the ISP, so you go to another ISP, or you've turned off the Wi-Fi, so you go to another Wi-Fi. Does that make sense? Some sense, yeah.
Talking about identity, is there any possibility or plan that external platforms, applications could now leverage this identity created?
Sure.
The same way of Facebook and
It's entirely possible, but we have no plans for that. It's not something that we see as, shall we say, fruitful business. Nobody ever makes any proper money out of identity. Identity is one of these things like privacy. Nobody buys it, nobody pays money for it. It's got to come as a byproduct of some other thing. And the some other thing is Chama savings. So we're doing Chama savings. We get identity for free. Yeah, we can do something with it if somebody comes up with a useful business case, and we can provide APIs and so forth and so on.
But the identity belongs to the Chama and to the people of the Chama, so they would have to want to do this and not us, because we will not be able to see anything of it. It's just inside the Chama. And if something would be done like this, any Chama would have to join into it on their own will and wish. And maybe they find some useful thing because they have the data and find some use for it.
So, Ian, you tell me if I'm wrong with this, but I think one way that would be done is like the financial records that are created between the Chama. Because the Chama can share these records with anyone, not records, they can share the records, right? And, yeah, they can show this to someone. So the way I think about it, although I'm not developing it, I'm working on the front end with the customers and the Chamas, is they could use this to bolster to add more information on the CRP, for example. So you could go to a bank and say, look, I've also been saving on this Chama, so maybe that would entitle them to a better loan. Because right now, what is happening, there's a lot of data within the small Chamas, because they save every time. They pay back loans. But if you go to, I met this lady from Yeri, who's like part of 3 Chamas, she saves in those Chamas regularly. But if you go to her mobile phone and try to take out a loan from Shwari, she doesn't qualify for a loan. And why is that? She's saving offline. So I think we tap to some of that data. That's how I think about it. And it could be useful for some of those providers. But they obviously have to talk to the Chama and see the Chama reacts. So it's like we're moving the control of data from these big companies and handing it to the groups themselves. So the groups are the ones who own the data. It's up to them to decide.
Yeah, it's to those who you trust. So it's not only me, it's those whom I trust. And they probably have a better idea what I really need or should do than what I am wanting to do because I'm desperate. So it also helps me.
Okay, so one last question, then two last questions, then we call it.
I'd like to rephrase the question on security, not in terms of private keys or anything to access that prevents you from accessing, but in the sense of blockchain, the fault tolerance is usually low is usually actually high when you have nodes. So, but if you see you have a blockchain for each channel, you have very few nodes, the fault tolerance goes down, right?
Yes.
Again, you mentioned DAO. DAO, decentralized autonomous organization. Don't you feel it's more efficient if it's whatever you do is more represented well in a DAO? Because DAO can have many members, and the DAOs can be part of other DAOs. So, is it more? Okay, from my perspective, it's a good notion, but I feel like it's too early to ride on your own chain rather than ride on the existing ones with more nodes.
Yes, it's a really good debate that I don't think the blockchain community has really got over yet. On the one hand, we believe that decentralization is really important and we want thousands of nodes. On the other hand, if you count the number of nodes that are an effective control of Bitcoin or Ethereum, because they are the mining pools, it's like 3 or 5, and that's not many. Chamas have 5 to 30 people. So at 30 people, they already have more nodes in control if they're all running a node than Bitcoin does in terms of effective control. So the question then becomes, what does that number mean? Is there a number? Is there a sort of benchmark, or et cetera, et cetera? And I would say that for a Chama, the security benchmark there is we shouldn't need to be more reliable than the Chama itself. So if we've got 10 people in the Chama, I don't think there's any point in having more than 10 nodes, because the Chama itself is going to be the difficulty, the bottleneck. And the other thing is that there is, if you like, an alternate theory in systems thinking, and that is you don't actually want a completely reliable system. If you have a completely reliable system, eventually it's going to hit some problem, and that problem will blow everybody away because we never predicted it. And that's the DAO, for example. They didn't really predict what would happen with the DAO. People might have warned them, but nobody was listening. And that problem caused Ethereum huge amounts of trouble. What we would really like, however, is a bit more trouble in smaller and smaller doses. So I'm actually quite comfortable with the notion of a Chama having 10 nodes and 3 or 4 of them failing every month, because that tests the resilience of the system. I'm not sure I would want a blockchain of 1,000 nodes protecting each Chama, because we would never get to test the DAO that way until it happens, and then we've got 1,000 Chamas who have suddenly lost their money, and that would be chaos.
It's easier for you to have more malicious nodes in a sense that 10 number of nodes can have more malicious nodes working against your blockchain. So it removes the sense of being immutable. See, if I have 1,000, it is hard for me to get more malicious nodes that work against the chain. So they are undoing and creating their own.
Yes.
If you have 10, it's easier. So it removes the sense of immutability in your chain.
So yes, but if you've got 10 people in the Chama and those 10 people decide to attack the Chama, they are the Chama. So there's no point in being more reliable than they are.
Actually, if you look at it, all the data that you have in the Chama is just those people in the Chama. So actually, if everybody of them is a node, it's completely decentralized. And it's decentralized to nodes who trust each other, which is maybe something that you can add.
Yeah, so how do you intend to make revenue out of it? Will you sell the app as a service, or will you get it from the transaction fees?
So there are transaction fees in the system. There's none at the moment. We just haven't coded them up, because the problem with transaction fees is that at low numbers, they're worthless. It's only when it's very large numbers that you get money from transaction fees. So there's none there yet, but there will be. There are guarantees which will be used for staking people's word or bond, which is what Chamas already do, and that can use the token that we're going to put out. One of the big, if you like, probably the most important revenue source is exchange fees. So, for example, when you convert Kenya shillings from paper money to digital money, there's a fee that can happen for that, a bit like M-Pesa. If you're doing a purchase of some instrument, there can be a fee for that. And some of the instruments can actually generate quite high fees. So one of the things there is that although we cannot control or monopolize the market, we can see it further ahead than anybody else. So we can be prepared to provide the fee-based exchanges that are desirable. And those fees will make quite a bit of money. So exchange fees, in short, is where there's a lot of money to be made.
Okay, let's give them a clap for